What if I told you that behind the screaming guitars, blazing lights, and thunderous crowds, some of heavy metal's biggest names were slowly destroying themselves? They looked untouchable rock gods, living larger than life, with endless fame, money, and fans at their feet. But away from the stage, many were consumed by addictions that left chaos, broken bands, and even death in their wake. These are the 25 worst junkies in heavy metal history. 25. Joey Jordison. Slipknot's original drummer was a force of nature, powering the band's brutal sound with unmatched speed and aggression. But offstage, Joey struggled with heavy drinking and drug use that worsened as the years went on. His battles with addiction affected his health and performances, and eventually, he was dismissed from the band he helped create. Joey passed away in 2021, leaving fans heartbroken. His decline was a painful reminder that even the most powerful musicians can be undone by their demons. 24. Paul Gray. Slipknot faced another tragedy with bassist Paul Gray. Known as the emotional anchor of the band, Paul quietly fought his addictions for years. In 2010, he was found dead in a hotel room, the victim of an overdose. His passing not only devastated Slipknot, but also exposed the darker side of the fame and chaos that surrounded them. Paul's talent and passion were undeniable, but drugs cut his story short at just 38 years old. 23. Chuck Schuldiner. Chuck Schuldiner, the mastermind behind death and often called the father of death metal, was an innovator who pushed metal to new extremes. But behind his brilliance, Chuck struggled with substance use that left its mark on his health and career. Though not as notorious as others on this list, his brushes with drugs added to the chaos of his life before he ultimately lost his battle with brain cancer in 2001. His legacy remains towering, but his struggles reveal the vulnerability behind the genius. 22. Pete Doherty. Pete Doherty was infamous, more for his addictions than for his music at times. Though not strictly a metal musician, his reputation as one of rock's most notorious junkies often tied him to the same self-destructive world. Known for extreme heroin and crack use, Pete's habit often overshadowed his talent, dragging his bands into chaos and nearly destroying his life. His name became synonymous with drug-fueled scandals, showing how far addiction can drag a musician away from their craft. 21. Chris Holmes. One of the most infamous scenes in metal history is Chris Holmes floating in a pool, slurring his words, and pouring vodka over his face in the documentary The Decline of Western Civilization Part 2. That moment captured the depth of his addictions. As guitarist for WASP, Holmes lived out the cliché of rock and roll excess, with drugs and alcohol steering his career into chaos. His shocking public unraveling became a warning sign of how addiction can strip away dignity and talent in front of the world. 20. Shannon Hoon. Shannon Hoon was known for his haunting vocals and emotional performances, but his addictions were equally intense. Years of drug abuse followed him through his short career, and in 1995, he died of a cocaine overdose at just 28. His death came only a few years after Blind Melon's biggest hit, leaving fans mourning not only the man but also the future music he could have created. Shannon's downfall remains one of rock's saddest cautionary tales. 19. Kurt Cobain. Though Kurt Cobain is more often remembered as the face of grunge, his ties to the heavier side of rock and metal are undeniable. Heroin became central to his life, clouding his creativity and pulling him into isolation. His struggles with addiction, depression, and fame eventually ended in tragedy in 1994. Kurt's story isn't just about drugs, it's about how addiction can magnify pain until it swallows everything. His death at 27 cemented his place in history, but left behind a haunting reminder of heroin's grip. 18. Johnny Lane. As the frontman of Warrant, Johnny Lane brought glam metal to the mainstream with hits like Cherry Pie. But as the spotlight faded, drugs and alcohol became his constant companions. Johnny's addictions ruined relationships, derailed his career, and sent him into a downward spiral he never escaped. In 2011, he was found dead of alcohol poisoning, his life cut short at 47. For fans, his story was another example of how fame and addiction often go hand in hand. 17. Sid Vicious. Though Sid Vicious was more punk than heavy metal, his reputation as a junkie became legendary in rock culture. His heroin use was constant and reckless, overshadowing his limited musical ability. His short life ended in 1979 after a fatal overdose while awaiting trial for the murder of his girlfriend, Nancy Spungen. Sid's name became almost synonymous with heroin itself, a symbol of wasted potential and destruction that echoed through the entire rock scene, including metal. 16. Dave Navarro. Dave Navarro's struggles with heroin were long and brutal. As a guitarist, his creativity was undeniable, but his drug use often consumed him. For years, he battled an addiction that left him in near-death situations, fractured his relationships, and nearly ended his career multiple times. Navarro's story is one of survival, but it's also a raw reminder of how even the most talented musicians can be brought to their knees by heroin. 15. Razzle. Nicholas "Razzle" Dingley wasn't addicted for decades like some others on this list, but his life ended in one of the most infamous drug-fueled tragedies in metal history. In 1984, while partying with Motley Crue's Vince Neil, a drunk and high Neil got behind the wheel and crashed, killing Razzle instantly. He was only 24 years old. Razzle's death not only ended a promising career, but also haunted Vince Neil for the rest of his life. 14. Vince Neil. Vince Neil's addictions to drugs and alcohol shaped much of his wild life in the 80s and 90s. His drunk driving crash that killed Razzle became a defining moment, one that forever stained his reputation. Despite this, Vince continued living recklessly for years, struggling to balance fame with the chaos of addiction. His career with Motley Crue survived, but the damage to lives around him couldn't be undone. 13. Tommy Lee. Drugs and alcohol fueled much of Motley Crue's chaos, and Tommy Lee was no exception. The drummer lived fast, partied harder, and constantly found himself in the middle of scandals. His lifestyle of excess became part of his image, but it also dragged him into legal trouble, public breakdowns, and health issues. Tommy embodied the cliché of the drug-fueled rock star, often blurring the line between entertainment and destruction. 12. Randy Rhoads. Randy Rhoads was a rising star, a young guitar genius who had already left his mark with Ozzy Osbourne's band. He wasn't known for decades of abuse like others on this list, but the drug-fueled environment around him played a role in his tragic end. In 1982, while the band was on tour, Randy joined in reckless stunts after a night of partying and cocaine. A joyride in a small plane ended in disaster, crashing and killing him instantly at only 25 years old. Though his addiction history wasn't as prolonged as others, drugs and excess were part of the chaos that stole one of metal's most promising musicians far too soon. 11. Phil Anselmo. Phil Anselmo's powerful voice made him one of the most iconic frontmen in heavy metal, but heroin nearly silenced him forever. In 1996, after a Pantera show, Phil overdosed and was clinically dead for several minutes before paramedics revived him. The experience was terrifying, but even after that, addiction clung to him for years. His struggles caused tension with his bandmates and played a role in Pantera's fractured relationships. Though Phil eventually managed to fight back and survive, his addiction marked a turning point that forever changed both his life and his career. 10. Mike Starr. Mike Starr's story runs parallel to his bandmate, Lane Staley's. As bassist for Alice in Chains, he lived in the same haze of heroin that surrounded the band. Mike admitted to introducing Lane to heroin, a decision that haunted him for the rest of his life. His appearances on Celebrity Rehab showed just how much guilt and pain he carried. In 2011, Mike himself overdosed and died, another victim of the same drug that had destroyed his closest friend. Alice in Chains lost not just one, but two members to heroin's unrelenting grip. 9. Lane Staley. Lane Staley's addiction story is one of the most haunting in music history. With a voice that captured anguish like no one else, he became the face of Alice in Chains' dark, grunge metal sound. But heroin slowly consumed him until he became unrecognizable. By the end, Layne was a recluse, weighing less than 90 pounds, with his body ravaged and his spirit broken. When he died in 2002, alone in his apartment, fans weren't shocked, but they were devastated. His death became one of the defining tragedies of the grunge metal era, showing how addiction could destroy even the most gifted voices. 8. Scott Weiland. Scott Weiland was a magnetic frontman, able to command stages with ease, but heroin followed him at every turn. His bands were constantly disrupted by his addiction, with tours collapsing and bandmates growing frustrated by his unreliability. Even when he found success with Velvet Revolver, heroin still haunted him, and by 2015, it claimed his life on a tour bus. His voice had carried pain, but in the end, the same demons that fueled his music also destroyed him. Scott's fall was a tragic echo of so many other frontmen consumed by the needle. 7. Steven Adler. Steven Adler's downfall was one of the most publicized in heavy metal. As the original drummer for Guns N' Roses, he was part of their rise to fame, but his heroin addiction quickly spiraled out of control. His bandmates grew frustrated as his playing suffered, and eventually, he was fired in 1990. Adler spent years battling health issues from his drug use, including multiple strokes that left him partially impaired. His story is especially heartbreaking because his career was destroyed not by lack of talent, but by heroin's grip. 6. Slash. Slash was as much a symbol of excess as he was of guitar mastery. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, his heroin use was relentless. At one point, his heart actually stopped for 8 minutes after an overdose, and doctors warned him that his body was shutting down. Yet somehow, Slash survived and eventually turned his life around. His survival feels almost miraculous, considering how deep he was in addiction. His story shows both the destruction heroin can cause and the rare chance of redemption when someone finally claws their way back from the edge. 5. James Hetfield. James Hetfield's addiction wasn't about needles, it was alcohol that nearly destroyed him. For years, he used drinking to cope with anger and pressure, but by the early 2000s, it had spiraled out of control. In 2001, James entered rehab, an event documented in the film Some Kind of Monster. Fans saw a broken man struggling to hold his life and his band together. Rehab gave James a second chance, and Metallica survived because of it. But his journey revealed that even the strongest frontmen can be undone by addiction. 4. Dave Mustaine. Dave Mustaine's career is defined by both genius and chaos. After being kicked out of Metallica for his wild behavior and substance abuse, Dave formed Megadeth, but heroin and alcohol nearly destroyed him again. His addiction led to countless overdoses, blackouts, and near-death experiences. At one point, nerve damage from a drug-related incident nearly ended his ability to play guitar. Yet, against all odds, he clawed his way back and kept Megadeth alive. Dave's place in heavy metal history is secure, but it's impossible to separate his success from the shadow of his addictions. 3. Lemmy Kilmister. Lemmy lived a lifestyle that should have killed him decades earlier. His daily diet included amphetamines and a full bottle of Jack Daniels, a routine he kept up for nearly 40 years. Fans saw him as invincible, the ultimate rock outlaw who somehow survived longer than anyone expected. But by the time he died in 2015, cancer and years of abuse had finally caught up. Lemmy's name is legendary, not just for his music, but for the sheer scale of his excess. He wasn't a junkie in the traditional sense, but his constant drug and alcohol use made him one of the most extreme figures in heavy metal history. 2. Nikki Sixx. Nikki Sixx's addiction nearly killed him more than once. His most famous overdose in 1987 left him clinically dead until paramedics revived him with adrenaline shots. His diaries reveal just how much heroin had consumed his life, days spent alone, hallucinating, and shooting up without care for survival. His band, his health, and his relationships were destroyed and rebuilt over and over again. Few junkies in heavy metal ever went as far down the rabbit hole as Nicky, and even fewer survived to tell the tale. 1. Ozzy Osbourne. At the top of this list stands Ozzy Osbourne, the Prince of Darkness himself. His drug and alcohol use is the stuff of legend. For decades, he consumed staggering amounts of substances, from booze and cocaine to pills and beyond. His antics, biting the head off a bat, getting banned from Texas for urinating in public, were fueled by his addictions. Black Sabbath nearly fell apart because of his unreliability, and his family endured years of chaos. Scientists have even studied his DNA because of how unbelievably his body withstood decades of abuse. Ozzy remains alive today, a living symbol of both the destruction and bizarre survival that comes with heavy metal excess. These stories remind us that behind the loud music and flashing lights were human beings who couldn't escape the grip of addiction. Some lost their careers, others lost their lives, and all left behind a cautionary tale that still echoes through the world of rock. The question is, how many more legends will fall before the cycle finally breaks? If you want more untold stories from the dark side of music history, don't just stick around. Hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next dive into the scandals, secrets, and shocking truths hidden behind the stage.